6:35. I'd like to call this Planning and Zoning Commission special meeting to order. May I have a roll call, please?
Lori.
Here.
Martha.
Present.
Duncan. Here. Sarah.
Here.
Eagle.
Here.
James.
Here.
Chase.
Thank you. We have a quorum. All right. I'm going to call this special city council meeting to order. Can we have a roll call, please?
Mitchell.
Here.
Tobias.
Here.
Heiser.
Here.
Flores Kale. Here. Zuniga. Bradshaw. Parsley. Here.
All right. We'll do citizen comments now. Is there anyone who wishes to come forward and speak? Seeing none, it's closed. You have to do that too? No, I think we can go join from here. Okay. All right. Consider possible action, discussion between the Planning and Zoning Commission and the City Council with facilitation by Verdunity, the city's comprehensive planning firm, regarding managed growth strategies for the City of Cal 2030 Comprehensive Plan Update. Mr. Atkinson.
Will Atkinson, Director of Planning for the record. As stated by the Mayor, this is a workshop for the Joint Commission and the City Council for the comp plan. And A.J. Fowler and Marshall Hines from Verdunity are here, and I'll let them take the floor.
Thank you, Will. Good evening, everyone. We're really glad to be back with you again tonight. We're especially glad that everyone has snacks, so that should help with having to listen to us for a little while. So we have a short slide deck that we're going to run through with you all tonight, and we're going to break it up into kind of three pieces. We do want to start, of course, with just some reorientation information and just kind of reminding ourselves how we got to where we are today. We're going to talk a little bit about, at that point, some of the conversations that we've had in the community over the last day and a half. And we're going to go through some growth scenarios. Marshall's going to walk us through a couple of those scenarios. And then at the end is where we're really probably going to spend the majority of our time tonight workshopping with you all. And that's really just kind of getting your information and buy-in on a number of things that we are considering, given all of the input that we've received to date. And we really need your help in just helping us make sure that we're on track and that we're capturing things appropriately. And so the next time that we're able to meet with you all, you're able to have a product that is in line with what your expectations have been thus far. So briefly, just a reminder of the project timeline itself. We are right smack at the halfway mark in the project, and it may not seem like that's possible, but it has gone fairly quickly. And so at this point, we've really wrapped up all of the fact-finding and the data gathering, all of the things that you really helped us with in that first trip and into the second trip. And so we are really entering the plan production mode at this point, putting together the actual product that you'll see at the end of this process and be considering for adoption. So how did we get here? You might remember in phase one, we started with, can you just go back for a second? You're okay. We started with really focusing on the land use fiscal analysis. That's going to be important again in a moment. You'll see how Marshall is going to refer to that as he's walking you through some scenarios. That again, to remind you, is where we really took a look at all of the data regarding your property tax situation, your collections for locally. We were able to map that and look at that on a per acre basis and really show you how your city is performing on a parcel by parcel basis. And so we had some really good productive conversations around that, paired with some surveys and information from the public. We've spent a great deal of time at the outset of this with your staff as well. And that led us into phase two, where we really started putting together one of the most important components of a comprehensive plan in Texas, which is the future land use map component, really projecting the different types of uses that you're going to have coming to your door and the organization of where and how those should be located around the community. Also, of course, looking just at some of the growth that you're expecting to see, really getting to fine-tune and understand what that growth looks like. And this group in particular was really helpful with that. So again, as we're looking through this trip and leading into the next trip, we're really kind of winding down the collection process. We're winding up the plan production process, and we'll be talking with you in our next trip in July, specifically about implementation strategies for this plan. So let's go ahead and look at what we're going to do tonight. So again, I mentioned this has been a really collaborative effort. First of all, we really got a lot of feedback on the pattern and the nature of growth that's happening here and what's really intended. And we did that, of course, with your staff, We did that with the P&Z and the council, and we did that through the work session the last time we were here. We also got some really good feedback from all of you on different place types and the character that you were looking for in communities. We used that polling tool, and you all talked a little bit about what should be factored into considerations when we're trying to organize land uses in Kyle, the intensity levels of housing and commercial and industrial uses. And then we also looked at the locations for those development types. We've gone through 5 or 6 iterations at this point of a future land use map, and that has been very helpful. The staff has been instrumental in giving us markups, keeping us abreast of things that are entitled and that are already happening so that we can make sure that we factor in those things as we're looking forward. Next slide, please. So what we're going to do tonight is to take a look at a couple of growth scenarios. So let me preface this by what we're trying to do tonight. I urge you to think about scenario 1 as being sort of the present day scenario, right? It's something that you're already comfortable with, and it's something that you're already familiar with. And we're looking at this in terms of a spectrum, if you will. So the second scenario we're going to look at is a scenario that's really factored on putting into practice a lot of the concepts that we've discussed with you all that help have that impact of creating more fiscally sustainable development patterns in your community. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't stress this does not happen overnight, and so this isn't going to be an attempt to make that happen suddenly. It is going to be a process for the community. And so what we really need to do tonight is kind of dial in where on the spectrum that scenario 2 falls. A lot of this is things that we have to do preparation today to get that outcome tomorrow. And so as we do with any comprehensive planning process, some of that's about taking stock of the processes, the plans, the different folks that you have involved in your development reviews, really understanding if you're set up for success in that regard. And scenario 2 also makes some presumptions that were based on the answers that you gave us the last time that we were here. So one of the things, for example, that we spent a good time talking about was diversity of housing, both in terms of housing type and housing affordability in Kyle, and that being something that was important to you all. So that's an example of some specific feedback you gave us that's been factored into this second scenario. Another thing that's unique about it is that it's really intended to happen within the infrastructure that you've built, and we'll talk about that more in a moment. Next slide, please. So, purpose of today's discussion, again, this is not a binary choice where we're asking you to pick something, and that's what we're going with, and starting tomorrow, that's what Kyle will develop as. What we're really doing is trying to find out where you land on that spectrum in terms of comfort level of what you think is feasible, given your individual and collective knowledge about what's happening in the community, and where you'd like to ultimately be. The timing horizon for this particular plan is somewhat short. 2030 seems, on one hand, a good deal away from us, but it will be here before we know it. So it's not just about setting up within that time horizon. It's also for us to help you put the pieces in place so that after 2030 and beyond, you have the framework within which to create that development patterns to serve the different types of businesses and industry that you're trying to do. And so what we'll do after our conversation tonight is very similar to what we did after our last workshop, which is to basically take all of the information that you've given us and craft a final version of that you will see featured as one of the many maps that will be put together in the comprehensive plan. So I think what would be helpful at this point is to work through and just talk through the scenarios that we put together for you. Again, keep in mind as you're hearing this information, scenario 1 is really present day, and scenario 2 is trying to figure out in the future where you'd like to be. Now, I will say these are not two extreme ends of a spectrum. This is already something that's very much been calibrated for Kyle based on the information that you've given us. This isn't exactly what we would present in any other city that we work, and so we have tried to try very specifically to make it reflect and tie back to the information that you've given us, the information the public has given us, and some analysis and data points that we've been able to collect. So I'll ask Marshall to walk us through those scenarios.
So before I get into covering these with you guys, I want to outline that we're going to see 2 specific pieces of information. The first is we've taken the analysis that we did for you guys, the land use fiscal analysis that was created at the beginning of this project, and gave you kind of an idea of where the city is with the development that you have on the ground today, and the fiscal health of the city given that situation. As you'll remember, what we found is that the actual money that should be either being saved or spent on your infrastructure each year is more than you're actually putting away. And what that means is that some of your maintenance needs get deferred. That's the reason that sometimes we have to go through a bond process to rebuild a road, etc. And so these two scenarios that we're about to show you, as AJ points out, the first, it's taking the pattern of development that you guys have today and extending that outward. Extending it to where? Out to 2030, when the projections that the city has given us that there's going to be another 25,000 people coming to the city. What would the fiscal situation in the city look like if we kept doing what we were doing to get those extra 25,000 people? So similar combination of residential versus commercial versus mixed development. Scenario 2, as AJ pointed out, is trying to take a look at everything that we've discussed up to this point and put some numbers behind that. If the future land use plan, as we have it drafted right now, was adopted and utilized as a primary governing document going forward, what could you see a better return if you chose to do that? So we're going to walk through that real quick. And I'll say the second part of what we're going to talk about, the one that's actually really, really important to get feedback on you guys from tonight, is the applicable trade-offs that you have to take if you choose part of one of these scenarios or the other. As we said, they represent two ends of a spectrum, but we're trying to dial in there a scenario that we can move forward with. So when we start talking about the specific trade-offs from one scenario to another, we're going to try and elicit some feedback from you guys to help us make sure that we're running on the right path. So just a quick recap, the scenario 1 is built up of the land use that you have on the ground today, the values that you have on the ground today. It's based on the land use fiscal analysis that we created, just projecting that into the future. So effectively what we found is if you add 25,000 people in the same pattern that you have today, you will generate an extra $3.4 billion in new value for the city through new property value. As you develop that land, it becomes more valuable. You would have about $27 million of new service costs yearly. That includes things like infrastructure as well as ancillary services that you have to use, police, fire, wastewater, et cetera, police, fire, EMS, et cetera. And what that would create is the requirement of about $3,000 per household as a contribution to the city to cover those costs, right? Now, a couple of important things about this. I'm going to compare this when we see scenario 2 in a moment. You'll notice that this one develops about 4 square miles of land. That is based on sort of the density patterns that you have with residences right now. So if you extended that out for another 25,000 people, that's what you would need. And we'll see the comparison to that in a moment. The last 2 items that you see up here, I like to think of those as a bit of an either-or. They're presenting 2 options to you. Neither one of them are hard and fast. It's just to give you a genuine representation. Those of you that were here for the land use fiscal analysis won't be surprised that this creates a net loss in revenue year over year, because the pattern that we've seen right now shows that if we were actually setting aside the money that we need for infrastructure maintenance, we would be running a deficit. Part of the way that we get away from that right now is that we defer some of that maintenance and we get at that maintenance through alternative means, through, for example, the road bonds, et cetera. Alternatively, if you said, I don't want to run a deficit on this plan, but I do want to make sure that I'm funding all of the infrastructure needs that I have going forward, you would have to raise your tax rate to do that, quite a bit, in fact. Now, neither one of these are good options, but what we're talking about today is finding a better path forward. So let's talk through scenario 2. Scenario 2, as I said, is based on the draft future land use map that we've been working with you guys and with staff to refine, a growth management plan which broadly speaking focuses development where you already have existing infrastructure with the intention of better utilizing that. The future land use plan is heavily influenced by the discussions that we had last time about the place types and what those place types are made up of, as well as feedback that we've gotten from you and the public previously. So scenario 2 does the same thing in that it adds 25,000 people to the city through 2030. It brings the development, it encourages the development in the core of the town where infrastructure is already run. And it does that in a more intense pattern than the average across the city. That doesn't mean that every single square inch of the city needs to develop in a more intense way. It simply means that parts of it will become more intense and those generate more value. As you'll notice, the value generated on this one is quite a bit higher than the other. Now, interestingly, the service costs actually go down here, and part of that is because you are making use of quite a bit of infrastructure that you already have. There's less horizontal expansion required. And as a result of that, the contribution per household goes down. It requires less land area to develop, which leaves open more space for other things. That could be agrarian or just rural land, green space, etc. And this pattern, according to the future land use plan, actually generates more value than it costs to maintain. And that is a key element here, which means that you could do something with that extra revenue, or if somebody was interested in lowering tax rates at some point, that would become a possibility if you're running a surplus. So these are the two fiscal ends of the scenarios, but what is really important is discussing what you actually get, practical things that you get should you choose all of one scenario, all of another, or some combination thereof. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to move us over to the trade-offs, and I'm going to ask AJ to walk us through that, and then we'll sort of tag team on these elements and discussing some specifics on them.
Great, thank you. So the setup that we want to take as we kind of walk through these tonight, there's a reason that we sort of structured the trip the way that we did. We wanted to culminate the trip with this meeting, and the reason that we wanted to do that is because we wanted to be able to collect information throughout the course of this trip and be able to share that with you this evening so that you get the benefit of knowing what we've been hearing during the time that we've been here, and furthermore hearing what we plan to do with that information that we've heard, and that way you have a more complete picture of how we're moving forward. So we'll talk through each of these trade-offs in turn. So in scenario one, as Marshall mentioned, it is very much a scenario that is predicated on the pattern that you have in Kyle today, which is very largely populated by single-family homes. Moving towards scenario two broadens those housing options significantly and allows for that mix that we discussed in our last workshop with you, where we went through the different slides of intensity levels, and we talked about what intensity levels might be right for the neighborhoods in your community, in different parts of your community. And so that's one of the principal differences between these scenarios. Now, one of the things that I want to make sure and mention is that for scenario one, one of the biggest reasons, one of two reasons, that it doesn't necessarily pencil out is because it is principally dependent on single-family homes. Some of those, of course, have varying lot sizes, and so we talked about, you might remember when Kevin Shepard was here presenting your land use fiscal analysis to you, he understood and explained to you all and helped you understand the relationship between the lot sizes and the homes on those and how that essentially affects the bottom line of what that has happening. A second important thing to share about this is that single family is not something that's precluded in scenario two. So we're not saying scenario two means everything but single family. We recognize that's a vestige of every community. It is something that is in high demand and therefore is something that will need to remain available to people in the community. It simply, again, is opening up the ideas of allowable housing types to promote the most flexible arrangements possible. And as we discussed in our last workshop, that has far-reaching effects that go to the character and the look and feel of your neighborhoods, the affordability level of different options, and we're going to talk about that affordability piece in just a moment as well. So what have we generally heard so far relating to these scenarios? Well, what we've generally heard people say is that there is an openness to allowing a broad mix of housing types. Overall, people that we've spoken to have been very receptive to this idea. The caveat of that level of receptiveness is that there will still be an allowance for these single-family pockets of neighborhoods that people can choose from. So overall, very receptive to that idea. And so that is a good piece of feedback that we can certainly take forward. One thing that we're probably going to take a look at on the heels of this trip, predicated by that particular bit of feedback, is that we're probably going to take a second look at the different equations for neighborhoods and making sure that those neighborhoods are, in fact, not single housing types, but have a mixture of different housing types available. And so that's something that we can look at through the place types and make sure that that language is captured there and preserves that. So let's talk about this one for just a moment. I think we feel that we heard from you the last time we were here that you were really open to broadening the housing mix. But how do you feel about that today? Some time has passed. Do you still feel that that's something that you're very open to? And are there any concerns that you want to make sure that we capture tonight as we look at tweaking this language? Nobody ever wants to go first.
I think it's hard to answer that without knowing what it's going to look like, like, and where it's going to go, because it's got to be very plan specific. So for me, it's hard to, I can't say one way or another. It's hard to figure it out.
No, that's fair. So I think some of the other things that you all told us the last time we were here is there was a concern, for example, when we talked about more higher intensity housing, that you all felt that green space was a really important part of that, and you felt that design and context was a very important part of it. Okay, good, I'm seeing some nods, so that's familiar to you all. So another thing that we need to make sure that we do with this plan is that we prepare you in a way that you're ready to move into a code update that can then codify those things that you're desiring to see, both in terms of making sure that that context is preserved and protected. We also have written the different place type descriptions to work that into the context as well. So we're actually saying in the plan, these are elements that are important for your new neighborhoods. To your point, being able to see in a case-by-case basis what's appropriate in that area. So we've put some language into the plan that gives you the cover to then move that into your code and then codify some standards that get at that. So hopefully that's one thing that can help your concerns as far as that goes. Does that help at all to kind of, okay, great. I see some nods. Okay, good. So that sounds like we're on the right track. Any other concerns or statements that you'd just like us to keep in mind as we're really trying to hone in on getting this right for you?
I don't know if it has anything to do with this, but how do we work to discuss to implement more options to purchase instead of renting? If we're going to go more vertically, I would like to see the chance to have ownership of condos instead of the renting of this apartment company. I would like, if it was for me, I would stop all of it.
Sure.
From going forward.
So what you're saying, I think, is also consistent with some of the comments that we've heard from people as well. That isn't something that the plan itself would encapsulate, but that is something you could look at with your staff as you're looking at your code process. And there may be some other tools. We're not attorneys, so I don't want to give you legal advice.
And I only added it because the zoning is different, right, for mixed use if we were to make a condo than if we were to do apartment rentals, right?
When you're dealing with condos and townhomes, correct?
Yes.
The ownership of those.
The zoning is different for those.
Not necessarily, Will Atkinson for the record. Not necessarily. It really comes down to how they set up the ownership arrangement through the private developer. So you can still have vertical mixed use, which has condominiums above the ground floor, which may be retail. Same thing with what essentially looks like an apartment complex, but they can be condominiums as well. You can do condominiums that are single family. So it really comes down to how that's set up from the development side.
Okay.
And that's true, and to kind of piggyback off of what Yvonne was saying, is it's hard to answer that when you don't see the concept, the design, what kind of development will be in that area of town. You know, is it going to mix with the area itself, or if it's going to be single, small homes? Let's say having houses, I'm just going to compare what we have in our city. Houses that you see in Plum Creek versus what you see in Kensington Trails, which is big lots, big old trees, 3-size brick, versus what you see is the smaller housing. If it's all going to fit, if it's going to match. And I think a lot of it also has to do with, again, the developer on what kind of standards we're going to bring to developing these kinds of homes. Who is going to be the builder? Who is going to be the developer for the commercial use? You know, are we going to have buildings like we see in South Congress, or we're going to see it more like we see at the Domain, versus what we see in San Antonio, where we call it 1626, that steeplechase kind of concept that we talked about. So I think it's a matter of seeing where we are as far as our codes and what we expect the developers that come in and saying that this is the kind of standard that we're looking for in our housing. And whether we have it with townhomes and condos, because that's also a big demand too. There's people there that don't want to have a house, but they want to be able to have ownership of a condo or townhome, and giving those options as well. So I wonder if it's just finally narrowing it down, going forward, what's going to be our requirements, what's going to fall into our mixed-use plan, and designing it to where we don't want to design like today when 10 years from now, 15 years from now, the whole concept of buildings could change.
Right.
Like we see it, like in other big cities.
So I like your comments because they set up 2 points for me, and I didn't even ask you to do that, so thank you. So a couple of points you allude to, though, that I think are important to mention here. Number one is understanding where we are on this trajectory forward of doing just that, of being able to be more selective about the growth you're getting, right? So this plan is one, but one, right, step in that process. So this is essentially creating the framework within which all of the tools that you're going to have to work with come underneath, and that includes the codes that you're talking about, the standards, establishing those things. So what we're trying to do here with this plan is create the runway so that it's available to you and you have the latitude to work within that. So that's one important thing to keep in mind. The second thing about that I think is important to understand is that there's one certainty that we know, and that is that if we don't use a plan to make allowances for diversification of housing, we know you won't get it. If you haven't made it possible, you won't get it. That's the one certainty we have. We can't stand here and tell you everything you're going to get. But if you don't make an allowance for it, you certainly won't get it. So it sounds like, and please correct me, anybody, if you think I'm getting this wrong, but it sounds like what we're hearing a lot of is this is a good first step. You're open to the idea, you're curious about it and would like to see where it goes, but you're very concerned that out of this, we give you some recommendations to make sure that you get the strategies and the standards and the codes in place to create the look and the feel and the character that you're wanting. Is that a fair statement?
I would also
Okay.
like to see, there is lots of land for sale in Kyle.
Mm-hmm.
But the truth of the matter is some of that's floodplain, and I don't really want to take that into consideration when we're talking about development.
Okay.
It may not sell, or maybe there could be a plan for the city to buy, something along those lines, because I can't say it's going to necessarily be realistic that people, I mean, you can sell whatever you want, and you can buy whatever you want, but as a city, there's a tremendous amount of pressure to push stuff through because there is a buyer, and there is a seller, and there's a plan. But is it really what's best for the city? So my hope is taking into consideration the floodplain areas that we have in Kyle. And also making sure that the affordability is spread throughout Kyle. And so making sure that all sides have something that people can
So
afford.
both good points. So as far as the floodplain goes, we are showing that on all of the maps that we're generating for the plan so that you can easily discern where that's the case and where it's not the case. And to your second point about affordability, that's where we talked about last time, kind of having more of a mix allows you to have more of that affordability. And in fact, there's another piece of this that's going to tie to that too. I think that will probably help you feel better about it. Please.
Planning. At what point do we really consider this new development in home building, which is single-family lease or build-to-lease homes for single families?
That'll be more as you're getting into the consideration of the proposals coming to you. As far as this, what I would urge you to think about is here is where we're really making things possible or not possible. And then the fine-tuning is going to come after this planning process. So here we're just basically creating the guardrails for what can come to you for consideration, but your codification efforts are really going to start to fine-tune that. And you bring up a good point that I would piggyback on, which is keep in mind that even the selection of a scenario or moving towards one of these scenarios What it does not do, and that we've tried to really emphasize with people over the last day and a half, is it does not substitute that for your processes, your level of discernment, your boards and commissions, your staff getting to make recommendations. It doesn't actually supplant or cut short any of the considerations that you're able to make. So you still have that latitude, and you'll be able to then, on a case-by-case basis, decide what works for you. Because at this level, it would be irresponsible, frankly, for us to try to make those decisions for you. You've got to have that latitude as you're working here day to day.
As we're talking about the development and the housing and the commercial, we also have to keep in mind when it comes to the transportation within the city. Because if you look at scenario one, you're looking at driving. Of course, we just passed a bond to get a lot of our roads updated, especially east of Kyle. But we're also pushing Vibe Trail. We're also pushing open space to where we want people to also get off the road and to utilize either it's golf carts or more biking. So those are things that we also have to look at, especially around neighborhoods, the accessibility for that. As you can see, we are still a growing city, but we're still very young. We are a very busy city. See all the traffic that's going on. You can go to any, whether east or west, Plum Creek, or over there by Bunton. There's a lot of vehicles that are out there. A lot of people are still wanting to get to places quickly and timely. But also, if we're going to push the agenda to get people to start walking more, riding more, doing different alternative type of transportations, especially within the commercial developments. It's something to keep in mind going forward on that end, how we can utilize that.
Will you guys also discuss, right now the city uses Uber. My concern with Uber is it costs $3.14 one way. And so if I were a high school kids that needed a ride to work, that would probably be difficult for me. So I don't know what kind of transportation that you guys can talk about.
We don't have in our scope doing transportation updates, but that would be something to consider. It sounds like that. We've heard several comments about that, so that clearly is a conversation locally that needs to continue.
Could it also be that in years to come, we would need to look at getting a city transportation system going, whether it's small buses or something like that, like some of the other cities that we see that would have bus stations or like when we went to Mueller, we saw how the Ubers were all set up, which was really neat. Because like on the side of the corner of the developments, like in the city or on the streets, it had a section just blocked off where just people can go to that location and pick up any Uber rides or whatever car that was going to pick them up. And they also had buses that were small little transit buses that would pick them up, like cart or something like that. That's just something to think about if we're going, as we're developing this, the transportation needs as well, and how we can make it more efficient along with the developments.
I have a follow-up question on that.
Please.
When you're going forward and kind of showing us as this comes together, can you show us like a mix of, it's just not in your scope to make that part of the plan that we're talking about? Can you show us kind of some options when that comes back, when we're seeing the concept, so that way we can kind of get an understanding of what those look like? I think it would help inform our discussion about transportation.
Okay.
What it looks like going forward.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, let's talk about the second one for a minute, which is infrastructure focus. So scenario one requires additional infrastructure to serve the area. And again, this is because in scenario one, that's more suburban patterns pushing outward. You're having that horizontal expansion, right? And that's also the second of two reasons that scenario one doesn't usually pencil out. That horizontal expansion and that rapidly increasing inventory of infrastructure that's necessary to maintain on behalf of the city, that continues to ramp up significantly. So those are two pieces about that. Now, the scenario 2 doesn't preclude new infrastructure entirely. The difference is the infrastructure in scenario 2 is more focused within your existing service area. So it's not to say that your existing infrastructure is exactly where it needs to be and you don't need to do anything else to it. We understand, of course, as you do, that there are additional needs for further investment and reinvestment within the bounds of the infrastructure network you've already built. As intensity grows, you will have to go back and reinvestigate and recalibrate maybe some of the widths of the streets, some of the sizes of the mains. So it's not without reinvestment. The difference is the investment is funneled into the existing system, whereas in scenario 1, that infrastructure is pushing outward. So what have we heard about this a little bit? People generally were supportive of scenario 2 and this option. They really liked the idea. What we kept hearing, the kind of phraseology was they liked using what's already been paid for. They liked the idea of leveraging what's already in the ground and on the ground and maximizing the use of that. So that was one thing that we did hear clearly. However, we have uncovered, as you have all known from the beginning of your service with the city, that there are some capacity limitations around the city. And so this morning, for example, we spent a good amount of time with folks from Public Works and engineering, and so we have gotten some better input from them, I think, and some more specific data about where those limitations exist. And so one of the tweaks that we will be making after this trip is to take a look at places where that intensity that we're proposing in the current draft might need to be dialed back a little bit to fit the capacity constraints that they've let us know that they have. Likewise, really re-examining the scenario in places where there are developments that are already in process. Of course, being Texas, we have to recognize entitled properties that already have approvals, and this plan in no way dissuades or makes them unable to move forward with those plans, but we do need to make sure that we factor them into the ultimate map. So those are a couple of tweaks that we're talking about making, given the feedback that we've received in the last day and a half. And so that gives you an idea of what we're thinking. We'd like to hear a little bit about what you think, if you think we're on track with that, if there are additional things that you'd like us to consider as we compare and contrast this idea of growing outward versus growing within first. Any thoughts or considerations about that you'd like to share?
I'm just thinking about the expansion. If it's 25,000 people, in terms of utilities, power, water, wastewater, it's the same amount of people. Might be a little bit of saving with no lawn watering, with some more condensed development, but I guess the main savings would be, an extension of branch lines for water and wastewater and that sort of thing. So I don't know what percentage of that would be, but do we have any notions of that, like how much we save? I know we looked at some metrics before about, what it costs for certain frontage.
Yeah. Effectively, what we saw when we were comparing them is that the service costs and what we're describing as those is not as initial build out of new things, but the ongoing yearly money that needs to be either paid for a service or set aside so that there is money there to replace it at the end of its useful life. There's about a $7 million yearly difference between scenario 1 and scenario 2. Now some might say that's not as big as I would have expected, but when you consider that scenario 2 also generates quite a bit more value, the net is quite a bit ahead. So it's true that 25,000 people, you guys are growing very, very quickly. I'm not suggesting that 25,000 people isn't a lot of people. It is. But as you start spreading out, it may not appear as though the infrastructure cost, if you choose to spread out as opposed to building from within, is all that monumental of a cost difference. But because the value changes so dramatically growing from within out, the net, it winds up being substantially better for you in scenario 2.
Building out versus building up.
Regarding the 25,000 growth, was there any analysis done to decide if the city has the wastewater or water capacity to sustain that?
So I'll attempt to answer the first part of the question. The staff may want to add on to this too. So we've understood from our meetings this morning that there are some limitations. We've gotten some additional information on where some of those limitations exist. But we also understand that the staff is in the process of doing some modeling and study to get more concrete answers to those questions. So we don't have all the answers to that, but we do know enough that we think we can retool and make another run at a draft of this map, something that's going to be a little bit closer to what they feel comfortable with, and then we'll be providing that to the staff so they can take another look at it and let us know what they're thinking. And I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
That's pretty accurate. There was we had a big focus on the water model this morning, and there was some components of it that it was really excellent that we got a lot of input from the Public Works Department on, and it did provide eye-opening opportunities to make adjustments accordingly. So the goal in the end here is to make sure this city we're doing our part to make it fiscally sustainable, better, and also at the same time providing for adequate infrastructure for the growth that we are experiencing and making it a better place, just for everybody who currently lives here and who wants to live here also.
So could there be, if an issue, like say, for example, we couldn't sustain more than an extra 15,000 people, would that be noted in the comprehensive plan? Is that something that you guys feel comfortable noting, like maybe after we get a new, outlet for wastewater?
I think it will depend on the timing of when that data comes in versus where we are in the planning process. But this plan is yours even after we finalize it and you've adopted it. You can amend it at any time to reflect the changing conditions on the ground. So whether that's during our time horizon or after, you would be able to certainly make adjustments to it.
For water usage though, either scenario 1 or scenario 2 wouldn't be that much different for people-wise, so say number of people.
Right.
But actually, in less land-wise, you might use less water. So, watering yards and such as that. So scenario 2, in theory, the same number of people would help us with our water conservation, hopefully, if those same people were either coming spread out or coming in the areas that are already developed in our city.
That's a very
So water usage, but not wastewater usage. Wastewater usage is, when you water your yard, that doesn't go back in, whereas wastewater is what was really limited at, I think, for the most part. So that to me would be a concern, is to make sure that we're not putting more out than we can legally be allowed to do.
Of course.
I was just going to say, I certainly don't think that we want to get ahead of the water professionals. We were informed that there is a new model that's being updated right now that you guys are supposed to get at some point. We were sort of broadly assured that these projections can be served by the time horizon that we're planning to. One thing I would say about the two comments that are coming in here about is one more water intensive than the other, that is such a complex issue that I think it would be unwise for any of us here just make a projection to promise that scenario 2 is somehow going to be better than scenario 1. What we do know is that, broadly speaking, on a per capita level, you can do some estimates about the amount of water that's going to get used. And because these are both planning to the same new population coming, we feel moderately confident that if the staff continues to believe that they have the capacity for it, then both of these models can, they'll accept they can both support, the capacity can support both of these models. The question really comes down more to, we think it comes more down to not the used services explicitly, but the tack-on costs that come along with doing it in a more spread out pattern. That's the principal concern that we're trying to get at here. And I don't want to jump the gun too much on AJ here. We have had some really fascinating discussions, both with economic development and with engineering today as well. And one of the things that we learned, or rather that we think is a notable addition to include in the plan, is some language about when we're thinking not just about residences, but about the kinds of major businesses coming to town, that trying to find a way to help encourage the ones that are more conscious of water usage is going to be an important part of communicating in the plan as well as ones they can use. We talked about things like reclaimed water, et cetera. So we want to include some of that in the plan as we move forward as well.
Great. Okay, let's talk about the next one for a moment. So the main differences here, and again, scenario 2 doesn't preclude scenario 1, but scenario 1 is what you're used to seeing, right? It's the commercial development that's in larger dedicated pockets, shopping centers around the city focused on major roadways. The second scenario actually allows those things to continue to happen, but furthermore opens up allowances for more commercial development that happens at a smaller scale that could be infused within your neighborhoods. One of the pieces of feedback that we've received is where in those neighborhoods is that appropriate? So that's one thing that was a really useful piece of feedback, was how do we determine what's really the appropriate place within neighborhoods for these types of things to go? However, we did generally, with people that we've talked to so far, did see that there was a great deal of support and a great deal of interest in having some of the smaller scale commercial neighborhood development. Anything from, a local coffee shop, a small cafe, a corner store, things along those lines that are similar to the housing discussion, whereby what we know for sure is that if we don't create the allowances for those things to come in, you won't be approached about them. But if we do, then you have some ability to discern if you like that particular proposal at that location. Does it meet the standards? To your point earlier, are the standards correct for that to fit the context of the neighborhood? So generally speaking, it seems that there have been people that are very open to this idea and are very interested in seeing it in places at Kyle. In the right place and in a way that is, I think the biggest word that we heard was that it wasn't disruptive to the neighborhood. That was something that was really important to people that we've talked to so far. So the opportunity being very carefully formulated as to what those locations should be, how those things should look, and how they should function. And when we think about disruption, what do we think about? We think about traffic, right? We think about making sure that there's a place for people to be together in a way that doesn't feel overly crowded. Those were some of the comments that we've received and heard so far.
Can I add one quick thing? Yes. I want to say that one of the really interesting things that came out of our discussion about this more low-intensity commercial development spread throughout existing neighborhoods is that when you almost to a person, everyone that we spoke to, when you asked a question like, hey, if you had a small coffee shop a couple of blocks from your house, would you like that? Yes. That was an answer for everybody. Would you like a small restaurant? Yes. Would you like a corner store? Yes. And as we kind of go into some of these other uses, we would start to hear feedback which seemed to reflect that people were concerned about, as you went through some of these uses that they associate with a larger scale of development, that began to scare people. So for example, the term corner store, at least in the context that we were referring to, it was the kind of place you can walk down the street, get a gallon of milk, pick up an onion, et cetera, and go on with your day. But so many people that we spoke with said, well, I don't really want a 7-Eleven 2 houses down from me, which we understand. And so part of one of the tweaks to the language that we think is going to be important in the document is clearly defining what neighborhood scale commercial places look and feel like, to ensure that those things don't allow for the higher scale of development that doesn't jive with, the kind of place that you would want to take a quick sidewalk walk down to. So just thinking of some of the tweaks that we're adding to the plan as we're going through it, that's one of them, really clearly defining these things.
Right, and then again, of course, that creates the framework for your code to then go a step further with the requirements that are necessary for that to happen.
I'd like to say that
Please.
I think that's going to be difficult. I mean, we live in a franchise world. There aren't really any corner stores. There is 7-Elevens and there's Starbucks. And
Sure.
So I know that we can put it in code, and we do have some code, but say these places have to be what you might call personally, individually owned or artisanal or something like that. But I don't know. You guys can tell me, is that Has that worked out practically in other neighborhoods?
Two things to think about. You're absolutely right. The idea that a Starbucks is going to be able to make a neighborhood scale Starbucks in an otherwise moderately residential place is probably not that likely. I've seen them in a few places, but is that coming to Kyle anytime soon? It's hard to say. But that's actually not, I don't think that's the key question that we're trying to answer here. The question is, if Starbucks wanted to do that here, could they do it in a way that would fit with the community's character? And ultimately, what we want to do in the comprehensive plan document is outline some of the elements that would make doing something like that possible. I think that you pointed out a pretty good thing, which is like how many, individually run artisanal, corner stores do we really see? This isn't the middle of Manhattan where we're stopping by the bodega. Of course. But these things do happen with a different sort of character in places that allow it. And I'm not sitting here trying to suggest that any particular place in Texas has got it all right. But if you think about, there are neighborhoods in certain parts of the Metroplex, there are places on the eastern side of Austin in older neighborhoods where when these things are allowed for and they are forced not to be artisanal or individual, but for the scale and character to fit the neighborhood, they're fantastic. They fit right in and they provide the capacity for somebody, your next door neighbor who you don't know but is just in love with the idea of artisanal bodegas to start one of these things up, because today they wouldn't be able to. So part of what a comprehensive plan is doing is setting up all of the sort of background that you need to make these changes in code so that the possibility is there. Because as AJ pointed out earlier, if it's not possible, it's never going to happen. So I think AJ also mentioned a little bit earlier that like one of the things about these scenarios is that if you guys adopted this plan 100% when we present it to you, no questions, you say, today we're getting serious and we're going to follow every single tenet of this, it doesn't magically transform your city overnight. It is the beginning of a process forward for these things. And we believe strongly that one of the things that you need to do is provide the capacity for these elements going forward. And that's what this is about. So fair point, though. I'm with you.
I feel like there's a little bit of tightrope being walked here, so I'm going to ask the question fairly directly. When I hear commercial development at a smaller scale,
Yep.
but then we don't want necessarily larger, intense uses. What are we saying about commercial, like local commercial in a mixed use at that point in time?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And
Does scenario 2 include that?
Yes, it does.
Okay.
So scenario 2 would actually, similar to the housing piece, it would actually allow the spectrum of commercial. So instead of either or, you're allowing the things in between. And the other thing that I would mention is no one's here to say that those bigger commercial pockets are bad. You're going to continue to get demand for those because of your location and the highway proximity. And so it's not that those things are bad, and we don't even think that those things should necessarily go away. But what we're saying is, with the second scenario, you're actually opening up the realm of possibility wider, so that you are allowing a broader spectrum of potential businesses to approach you about projects that they want to do. You haven't limited them to one size only, one size fits all. You're really allowing them to dictate based on their knowledge, because also we're not market experts and the market changes. So you have to build the flexibility in these plans for the market to also be able to dictate and influence what's going to come before you for your consideration. Does that help answer your question?
Kind of.
Okay.
Are we talking like specific types of businesses that would fit in that mold, what you're saying?
I think I was just making sure that we're not just proliferating neighborhood commercial lots, where there doesn't need to be neighborhood commercial lots. Because I think that's a worry that I have. Like, we definitely want an intensity that matches with the area it's around.
Yeah.
Okay.
And also, as you're talking about scenario 2, that necessarily means some of these like missing middle in commercial.
Okay, I see exactly where you're going. So it does necessarily mean that they would be included. But again, you remain in the driver's seat as to what comes before you, as to what's appropriate. So we're not trying to ascertain from a very high level, which this plan is intended to be, to dictate what levels of appropriateness match this intersection and that intersection. What we've done is we've created the place type based on the feeling from this group that character is something that you believe is really important and context is something you believe is really important. So we've tried to create these place types that have the flexibility built in them so your staff can do what they do best, which is plan. It's not matching colors, it's not formulas, it's actually looking at what's coming before them, ascertaining the surrounding environment, and then bringing to you a recommendation of whether or not this is really something that fits, and allowing you all to then fine-tune that proposal to make sure that there are conditions added and there are restrictions and the site is laid out in a way that also is appropriate. We don't want to preclude your ability to do that in any way. And so we have left that fairly broad.
I wonder how that would come later on from a legal standpoint.
Well,
If we have these businesses that are wanting to come there and we're limiting them because of the use, or just like what you're saying, not everybody wants a 7-Eleven, but there are people that said, well, I'm an owner of one, and why can I not be there because of the high traffic? I think I could sell my products or my services in this area. It fits the mold, it fits the criteria, but the city has so much strict regulation that it could get challenged later on, and do we want to get into that battle?
And that'll be a question for you as you put your code together. So the plan is really just setting up the framework for where these things could be considered, but then you will apply your zoning districts across the city to define that better. So the zoning would actually dictate, is this proposal something that could be considered, cannot be considered, or could be considered with conditions, as an example? So that will actually be kind of the next step once you have your plan in place. Does that help assuage your fears a little
Because I
bit?
think we go through a lot of that right now. So.
Yeah.
I think scenario 2 makes sense with how we're prioritizing the vibe trail. And we're wanting people to stop having to drive everywhere they go.
Right.
And so I would especially we want people to use the vibe trail, we want people to go from one place to another and not just always go to the same exact location, but have different places within different neighborhoods they can go, different restaurants, different small shops that they can visit. I believe scenario 2 works well with our priority of the vibe trail.
That's a great point, and that actually, we'll go ahead and go to the next slide. That actually sets up the next one too, which is talking about the transportation options that are available. Scenario 1, again, because it's more horizontally spread, therefore more distance, less compact street grids, it is generally going to require driving to get from place to place. Again, not necessarily a good or bad thing, just a fact of the reality of spreading outward. And scenario 2, to your point, does actually also provide, with some introduction of more of those compact building patterns, start to introduce the option of other things besides driving to get from place to place. And the way that you're already planning for this trail system and you're working on clustering commercial uses along them, giving people places to stop, is a nice setup for this. And this one was one that we really didn't get a lot of comments back from, with the exception of most people said, it would be nice to have that option. There were a lot of people that said, I don't know if I would really choose an option besides driving, and that's fine. But they were certainly open to other people having that choice. And in fact, a couple of comments that we received said, this might not be for me, but with the influx of growth that we're seeing and the younger demographic of the people that we're seeing, they're going to care about this. I don't necessarily care about it, but they might. And so this was another one that really folds in nicely to the last discussion as well, and didn't seem to be particularly controversial. And so you set that up nicely, and I wonder if you have any additional thoughts.
I think also we had this, people mentioned earlier about buses and stuff, that may have to come to Kyle, that may actually happen. But I think one thing that we can do is not make everything you need a vehicle for. So, if a person does not have access to a vehicle, then yes, we have the Uber. That might not be a perfect solution for everyone. But do they have options to do things, to get what they need from the store, to get a certain service, a haircut, whatever they need, without necessarily having to ride in a vehicle to get to that location? And so I think this also will help. While it may not fix that problem eventually, one day we need a bus system in Kyle. Maybe we will. I think this will help us, go longer without needing it, or help people find a house or a home in Kyle that doesn't need
an automobile for everything they do.
And it gets to the point to where there is a transit area to where they can be able to get to within the neighborhood and so forth, whether that they need to get to the schools, or we have our college kids needing to get to ACC or their job. It's just thinking down the road that if we can start looking at getting those options ready and then designing the infrastructure for it, and that also can not only be a good selling point for our city, but we can also say that, hey, look, we are looking into the future, and if there's people out there that don't have vehicles, and I know a lot of people in Austin that don't, because that's all they do is Uber, and they just ride the bus, and they ride the train rail. So it's just looking at that aspect there.
But everything I do right now is where I live. I need to get into a vehicle to go. I want to get a haircut, I want to buy groceries, whatever it is. If some of those options were available to me by another means, riding a bike, walking, something of that nature, that would cut down on my need for a vehicle. And in some situations, depending on where someone lived, they might not need one at all.
Right, and to your point of thinking down the road, creating these types of alternative development patterns in places throughout the city starts to build that naturally, where that actually is a possibility, even if you don't necessarily have it fully built out today. It's certainly easier than trying to retrofit that in later. So it sounds like you're pretty receptive to that idea.
So, my thoughts are, I keep going back and forth between the scenario 1 and the scenario 2, and it seems like you're generally making the argument that if we build more sprawling, less dense, it's more infrastructure, it means higher taxes. And if we build more compactly, it means less infrastructure and more affordability and potential, lower taxes and a surplus. One is profitable and sustainable for the city. One creates a deficit for the city. But the other side of that is, and which is it's like, what are the trade-offs to building in a compact manner? It's like when you're stacking people up on top of each other. These are the things I think folks think about. Stacking people up on top of each other, you're creating more vehicles on less street, which means more traffic, and the schools have to be built larger in order to serve more people in a smaller period, in a smaller area. And then also there's the quality of life of getting a larger home. On a larger lot. So that's something that I think that people aspire to. They want to be able to have larger lots. They want to be able to have larger square feet footage. And so I think one of the things that this model you're pursuing says is that you don't just build densely everywhere, but rather you trade off. So if you've got 50 acres of land, as opposed to dividing every inch of that land up by single-family residential lots with all the infrastructure that's needed, and having very little left over, big wide streets, all these things that have very little left over for parks, we're putting all of that quality of life into the lot size, which is bad from a sustainability standpoint, that you reduce the amount of acreage that can be developed on, but also allow for the increasing density, and then require that the undeveloped portion be used as quality of life amenities like parks. So do you intend to try to encapsulate that sort of mentality into this scenario too, where you're recognizing the trade-offs that you're asking us to make for density, so that we can try to avoid the proliferation of garden-style apartments all throughout our home or all throughout our community, and the proliferation of rentals as being the predominant housing type or residential type, so that there is still that opportunity. So it's like, I think everybody's saying that they're fairly on board. You can't argue with the math. You can't argue with the fact that one scenario will produce higher taxes, one scenario is a more profitable development pattern. But if we just say, oh, okay, well, then we're just going to let people build apartments wherever they want in order for us to be profitable, the trade-off for that could be worse than the surplus that we might receive. So we have to, if we're gonna all get behind a development pattern style like what you're proposing, it's got to come with more than just these are the areas where we want a lot of density. It's got to be, we want density in these areas, but we also want to make sure that the way we are allowing for the density still brings that quality of life and considers transportation and infrastructure.
Exactly. So very well said, and we recognize that this isn't an all or nothing proposition. There's elements of both sides of these things that people in your community are going to want, and there's elements of these things that are already here and they're not going away tomorrow. So really what we're trying to do is just kind of get an idea of the tolerance level. It sounds so far, we've still got a couple more that we'll move through fairly quickly, but it sounds like so far there's a lot of curiosity, openness to see what some of this could look like. But a recognition that you also want to preserve what you have here. And so this is more of a sliding scale. And so what we will be doing after tonight is really trying to just fine tune this a little bit more so that we're giving you some of these ideas that you're really open to. We're giving you to your point, we're giving you the latitude to make those decisions on a local level based on the information presented to you at the time. But you're starting to introduce some of these concepts that will also be really important for you to work into your code update effort. So it's really about just making some small incremental steps to start to let in some of these things that right now might not necessarily be possible. But again, avoiding making it an all or nothing proposition. Because that quality of life is also very important. The math, as you say, is very important and it's very convincing, but it's not the only thing. And it's not the sole decision that someone is going to, or the sole piece of decision-making data that someone's going to use in deciding where to call home. There's a lot of other factors that have to be included.
I just wanted to respond real quick to the mayor's comment. I think that this is a fantastic point. We are taking very seriously when we talk about the more intense portions of the city as they're being proposed. We always pair that with descriptions of the things that are necessary to make those places comfortable places to live that have high quality of life. So I think I sense and hear from what you're saying that what you want is that if the comprehensive plan suggests that this more intense way of development is acceptable across the city or in particular places, that we don't neglect that there are requirements that come along with that for those kinds of places to be good places that people want to be. Is that a fair assessment? Am I getting any what you're talking about?
Yeah, we need to develop in a sustainable manner.
Exactly
and
right.
So you're saying there's a scenario that is unhealthy and unsustainable,
Yep.
which is to proliferate single-family residential throughout our community.
Sure.
And one that is sustainable, which is high-density development along particular corridors.
Yes.
However, if we are going to pursue option 2, we need to make sure that we understand exactly how we're going to lay that out in such a way that the quality of life is not diminished by having people stacked up on top of each other and having our utilities being overrun and our road infrastructure being overrun as well.
Got it.
I don't
Thank
know
you.
if you guys are familiar, I'm pretty sure you are with the Mueller community.
Yes.
I think that's just a perfect example that how you are going to combine all that density that we need with the quality of life. Because you have all the single-family homes, you have the green spaces, and you have the commercial, and then you have, mixed use and apartments,
Right.
all in that same area, all with high quality. I don't think that, I can see us going towards that direction. It just has to be good quality.
I think that's a great point. Yeah, all density is not created equal for sure. And you all have been very clear that you expect a higher standard for your community. You're very much thinking about the way that those developments feel and the way that they look and also the way that they produce. And the answer's somewhere in the middle of those things, right? It's not going to be just one of those things alone. So I think what you've given us tonight is some good direction. The place types in particular that Marshall mentioned earlier, which is just generally, again, the categories of uses that we're organizing and showing where those need to go around the city, will be accompanied by some guiding language. So even as you're working through the process of getting your code updated and doing some other things that really calibrate the tools for your staff and for you to use, still gives you the guidance in the meantime that you can point back to that. So as you're having these conversations about what intensity commercial makes sense at this location, The plan, if we've done our jobs well, has given you the cover to have that conversation, and in fact has said you must have this conversation as part of the planning and the determination of how you want to proceed with this. Yes, sir.
Just general thought on scenario 2, which I tend to like. I think it provides a lot of the triggers that people the people who live here are most afraid of when they think of the future of Kyle. And so I would just strongly urge in this next iteration of this is to be as prescriptive and visual as possible in what that looks like, keeping that in mind, because while this might be in the best interest of the future of the city as a whole, you know, the people who live here now are going to see it.
Right.
And not see themselves being a part of it because of those fears.
Right.
So just...
I think that's a great comment and triggers that, yeah, that's a really good comment.
I do have a concern about if we do density, and people talk about being walkable and ride a bike. No, very few people are gonna ride one side to the other over 35 to get a haircut. So I just wanna make sure we're not isolating areas by building this density in certain spots. So it has to be evenly laid out through the city to make sure if I am gonna go to Walmart and I can park there and then be walkable, or I can go to the Plum Creek area and make it walkable. But I think if we just do it in certain areas, then it's gonna isolate people even more.
That's a great point. And so two things that I think will reassure you about that. First, when we're talking about from a residential perspective, that's where scenario 2 really focuses on spreading the different types of housing intensity throughout the community at a lower scale, as opposed to the pockets of apartment complexes, for example. Same is true on the previous slide where we talked about commercial. Instead of simply allowing only the big box retailers as an example, allowing those kind of neighborhood scale businesses in places throughout the community. So instead of concentrating those in islands, it's more spread throughout the community with, of course, your oversight as to where that feels appropriate. That's also, ironically, going to work well given the constraints that you have for water and wastewater. It's certainly going to be easier on those systems to slowly ramp up some of the intensity and spread that across areas versus having central locations of super high intensity. And that was part of our conversation with the staff this morning, was trying to kind of understand that intensity. And that was one of the things we asked them at the end was, does this sound like, by diffusing that around the city, that is more amenable to you all trying to serve it? And they said, yes, that sounds like a direction to go. So great comment.
So
right.
I have just a couple more thoughts. One is just kind of I think, the American dream is 2.5 cars, on an acre and a half, 2.5 kids and, 2-car garage on an acre, playing catch in your backyard, riding the bike through the neighborhood. And so I think that, probably a really good way to visualize this is if we're saying, well, we're trying to diversify our housing stock, which means have less of that single-family, large lot product moving forward and more of the townhome, condos, mixed-use type regimes. We just have to understand that those folks still have that yearning. And so it's our job to make sure that within every residential community, there is the ability for families within walking distance to be able to go and play catch and ride their bike and kick the soccer ball around and do those things. Right. And so that's that quality of life that should be non-negotiable for us. We shouldn't sacrifice our development, our quality of life just in order to be profitable by taking away that amenity that we're currently putting in an unsustainable way into single-family residential lots on a lot-by-lot basis. We're trying to bring it more as a community. So I agree with what Councilmember Heiser is saying. Like, we really need to be able to visualize that. Yeah. But then also at the same time, it's really important for the P&Z and for the council to understand that, like, you could have a 4, 5, 6 acre lot and they want to develop, an 8-plex or something on it, and maybe with a little corner store or something like that. But you can't go to that lot and say, well, we also need you to develop a park on your 6-acre lot. Right, so there is some, but what they do have to do is they have to contribute parkland development fees that come to the city, and with those resources that we are supposed to be providing that amenity in public spaces so that all of these parcels of land can coalesce around it. So there's like the master plan projects that are large, where the parks are internal, they're all kind of kept into one site. But it's just, we need to be making sure that we're developing a parks development plan that can make sure that we're investing in public park infrastructure all throughout our city, north, south, east, and west, and not just big parks, but also small parks, pocket parks, things like that.
I do want to comment on that, because if we are receiving the fees, the parkland fee for us to develop the public parks, then is there any specific amount of acreage in parks that we have to do per each acre that we're developing as residential?
That's going to be outside our purview, but that is certainly for the city to decide.
That could be us when it comes to our codes and our designing of what we want to do. And implementing developers that come in, or, you know, we want a certain amount of pocket parks within certain developments. We want, that's part of the code that goes along with it. Whenever you're building this development, specific areas of that.
So
Also to add, if we were to do, again, if they want to do, you know, neighborhood swimming pools, but that would have to be, I'm sure, part of an HOA coming through. But I think a lot of what you're saying, Danielle, and everybody else, is I think it's just whenever we start designing the concept of the plans for the city as a whole, we have ordinances in place already in codes to where all those will be in sync.
But that will be mentioned in the comprehensive plan, like.
Yes.
Because that'll be supportive of the codes if you say, okay.
That's correct.
We believe parks should be here and here and
Yes.
here.
So,
I think
yes,
that's what
so
she's asking about.
the job of the plan in part is to tee up that code. And so it won't prescribe what's going to be in the code exactly, because that's going to be, you know, whatever you all come up with. But it should at least encapsulate the things that you all have said. These are really essential parts of design and fit and context. And so we'll make sure that we'll include that as recommendations for you to work into your code update.
So we have rules in our subdivision ordinances about the requirement of parkland dedication or park creation within certain feet of every home. It's just, we haven't looked at it in years. It's been at least 5 or 6 years since I've even heard of those subdivision ordinances being brought up. So that'd be a great thing for P&Z to dig into, is to dig into our subdivision ordinance, figure out exactly how many parks are required per lot or within feet, and then test that and put some stress on it and see if there are changes that you want to make. You know, like we didn't used to require sidewalks, now we do. So it's like you want to be able to come out of your front door, get on a sidewalk, not have to get onto the street, and then walk to a park within so many feet. And you can put that to the test when they're showing their land plan to make sure they're following it, and it can help.
It is on our future items.
Okay.
Good.
Okay.
Yeah, I will say,
Yeah, to review, you know, paying money instead of placing a park there. There's also minimum sizes for city parks, like 5 acres, I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong, Will. I would think that's minimum size. That would have to change in order to do pocket parks. Anyway, it's coming up there. My concern on all this is, it's a little bit down the road about implementation. So in planning and zoning, we review mostly developers, and we did one today where it's all laid out and we can see everything on it. We know what's there, and the developer has control, and that developer starts with a vision, and then we get aligned with that division. Will works with them in planning and zoning, and then it's presented to us, and we can see it. With this other type of development, with this mixed use of development, let's say that it's mixed residential and commercial, is there going to be like one developer that will develop that area? How will that development be coordinated? In the mixed use areas I've lived in, they've been old cities, and they've grown organically. So businesses have come up and failed and gone away, and the ones that are the right ones are the ones that sort of survive. So I don't know how that process would look. fine.
Yeah.
I don't know how that would be made.
Yeah, that
That's
will
my
be, that will
concern.
also be something that you'll want to think about as you put your code together is how many different avenues do you want to create for that to happen? Some of that can happen organically if it's just given the parameters within which to operate. Other times you may have a single developer that wants to come in and do that as a single coordinated effort or a group of developers. But really what you'll probably care about at the end of the day is the outcome. Of how it's done and how it works together. But that would certainly also be within the purview when you start talking about your regulations moving forward. I think you were going to add something.
So, I'm a little, I like scenario 2 obviously a lot more like scenario 1, but I also am concerned about just the sheer concentration of the density in scenario 2. I think it's really important that we don't overload. I think we've all talked about that. But also, like, I've heard a lot from the table so far about language that fits more in scenario 1. You know, quality of life being specific things, or, you know, things not specifically that we have that we want to see less of. You know, I think in scenario 2, one of the big things that I'm looking for is like how we revision the things like garden apartments. Because I'll be honest, I'm really happy with my garden apartment. I quite like it. It allows me the ability to walk to get food, to come back without using my car. It's great and incredible. And there is a quality of life in that. There's a quality of life in being near folks. And so I think one of the challenges that I want to see, you know, coming from what we see coming up and also from us as planning and zoning is to, you know, ask ourselves, you know, what is that quality of life that we see, that the amenities in the scenario 1 sort of like build out that we want to see in our communities in scenario 2, and how specifically can we make sure those are implemented well as to not divide the community, as to make sure there is also an internal community space, you know, for folks. And I will say, I would be remiss if I didn't leave this meeting and say it, but like, those garden apartments that we have are really important because it's one of the only ways that some people can afford to live in the city.
Right.
Like, I wouldn't live here if it wasn't for the ability to have those kind of apartments, and so I think it's really important that we preserve a type of housing that includes the ability for you to have a front door into the city.
Right.
Because that's the only way you're going to get them. You have to get them to keep them here.
I don't know if that's true, because when we looked at the Mueller development, it wasn't the city, it was the development, and they built houses exactly the same, every one of them the same, and the developer said, that, and that is all gonna be low income. Like, they made it a point to make everything fair and equal, and then they were like, but with this one, you guys are gonna be limited on what you can charge. So that brings equality to the city, and that gives you an opportunity to come to the city in the same house as everybody else. So it may be more about who we're bringing in as developers than our city codes.
I also want to say it's not just that. Also, in the Mueller neighborhood, there are those kind of things on the other side by like Kirby Lane and things. Like those things that we would call garden apartments, if they were there, they would be zoned to look like what they have there. Those are the front door to that community in a lot of ways. I'm not just talking about low income, I'm also talking about every part of the income. Sometimes
It's a
middle
slippery
income
slope to couple garden affordability with low income.
Yeah.
Those are not the same things.
Because when people think low-income housing, they think, oh, great, they're gonna put an apartment complex or a mobile home. And we had that issue at Kensington Trails where people were in arms, oh, no, we need to get off our neighborhood. It's like, geez, people, it's like we're, we live in a first-time buyer, we're not exclusive. It's like, come on, it's like, be real. It's like, but it's just the fact, oh, low-income, it's gonna be crime and drugs and this is like, geez,
I think we have enough apartments.
But that idea of mixing it in, and scenario 2, mixing it in where, you have
it just can't be the same thing.
an apartment complex, maybe 4 or 5 stories.
They can't be stereotyped together that.
With mixed in, with houses around, that's kind of, it's a good thing because it's different. I don't, people, especially, in the South, it's, oh no, it's change, oh no, but they talk about when I grew up, this and that, we had a neighborhood, grocery store. It's like, you can have that, you can still have that, but people think, oh, it's mixed use, it's change, no, it's different, it's not, all that, but, quality of life, we can have an entire block of apartments. You look at quality of life, where the U.S. ranks, we're like 15th or 20th, but in countries that are in the top 10, they're all in Europe. You think of Europe, they're not single, they're not one house, big lots. Everybody's crammed in because you get to know each other. It just builds that sense of community versus I come home, I'm in my house, leave me alone type thing. I don't want to interact with my neighbors. So, I mean, you get that little thing, so.
Well, I think we covered, you guys spent a lot of time talking about this in our last workshop where we talked about, we looked at the numbers on what people are making here locally and that affordable lowercase a and affordable capital A are very different things. To your point, affordable is a spectrum, right? And so that kind of keys into the last one here, so I'll jump on it really quick, which is housing costs, right? So the American dream, yes, is very much, for a lot of people, it is that single family house with a big yard. For other people, it may just being able to own a home of some sort. And I think what we heard clearly from you all, I think probably the loudest and clearest the last time we were here, was that you wanted to make sure that you were creating an environment within which other types of housing where people could still feel like they had something of their own were possible in different scales and therefore different affordability levels. So that is one thing that certainly would fit within scenario 2. The thing about housing costs in scenario 1 is generally when you're only offered one type of thing, the costs are driven by what? They're driven by the differences in those things. And the difference primarily is size. It's the size of the home or it's the size of the lot, right? So by diversifying the ability to have other sorts of housing, the housing costs are more reflective of that inventory. It's not just driven by that one singular difference because there's a lot of sameness. It really breaks that up. So it meets the needs of a larger cross-section of the population, which was something that you all said you really felt strongly about. And so again, it sounds like the answer for everyone at this table might be somewhat different, but the question is there something for everyone at this table or is there not? Is that fair to say? That's mainly your concern?
I think that's what option 2 does, or scenario 2.
Mixed.
And, yeah, and it
Right.
drives.
While still allowing that
The issue
single
that we've
family.
had in recent years with driving up home values is that we haven't had enough supply to meet the demand, and
Right.
so therefore, because there's fewer distinctions between single-family residential, that's the only thing people can choose
Right.
from. But in this different world, we have different pockets of variety, and that's, I think, a positive thing.
We have homogeneity in Kyle. So like 10 years ago, Kyle was 95% single-family residential from a taxable value standpoint. Literally 95% of all revenue that we derive, property tax-wise, came on the backs of single-family lots. And we had no executive level higher-end homes in the community either at that point, which just meant that the burden just fell on, just very average home types, and it put a lot of stress on our property tax. Kept us from being able to invest in things at that time because we had no money. Over time though, that number has come down. Commercial and multifamily are coming up. I think a great question, I don't know if you're familiar with, there's this thing called a comptroller's audit report that gets issued every single year, and it will break down the city's total assessed value by single-family residential, by multifamily, and by commercial. So you can track over time what your product mix is. Now, it doesn't distinguish between industrial and retail, all of that, and maybe there are companies that can get you more of that, but at least from the comptroller's audit report, you can see a lot of that. And it has changed a lot. So we went from, in 2006, we were at 93%, to in 2021, we were at 73% from single-family residential. And we went from 7% to 18% on commercial and from 1% to 9% on multifamily. So for folks, they're thinking like, oh, we're like covered up with apartments. It's like, no, we're 9% apartments. That's what we are. So, and then the other thing that I do think that's important, I'm not sure it will speak to the comprehensive plan, but it's this idea of rent versus own. I think for sure everyone, not everyone, but many people wish to own. But in terms of the demand and how the market is growing and affordability just in general, the ownership group class of people who are wanting to purchase, that is growing, but at a far slower rate than the class of people that are wanting to move to our community who are looking to rent. And so if the only thing that they can rent is apartments, then that's what is going to be developed. So we could say, all right, we're going to give an R1C zoning for condominiums. Well, that's still 30 units per acre. It's the same. It's going to look the same. And then one person's going to buy all the condos and rent it out because that's what people want to do, is they want to rent. Or we can say, no, we only want to do single-family residential like Plum Creek North, that fancy west community we always talk about. Well, Lennar developed Plum Creek North. I was being sarcastic there, but the Lennar developed and sold off to real estate investment trusts, REITs, multiple blocks, not homes, blocks of that. And those REITs bought them up and put those homes out for lease, brand spanking new. So this idea of like, oh, we're only going to do this one zoning type because it's going to bring homeowners versus renters is very much not the case. The market is going to set who can own and who can rent. We want to make sure that if you want to buy, you have lots of options to buy, which I think is to what Danielle's point is, like condos. We don't really have, like if you want to buy a condo in Kyle, can you do that right now? Nope.
Well, I would say the peninsula had that rule. If you're gonna build a house for 2 years, you cannot rent it.
Those are conditional covenants and restrictions that a neighborhood can do for itself. Those are not restrictions that a city can place.
Not even at the, in a development
We can't say
agreement?
in this zoning class, there's no rentals allowed.
But can you put that in a PA, right? I mean, I know it doesn't have to do with this, but you can put that in a development agreement, right?
That's where I brought up the question on the legal part. What can we do and cannot do if it has to tie, like what he's saying on that?
Well, is it right that we should do that? Is it right that we should make a zoning category and ban people from renting within a particular?
No, well, ideally, if we're talking about affordability and we want to help people build up the credit and, you know, help first-time home buyers, that's why it was an option, you know. I don't know.
Sounds like you've got a lot to talk about in the future too.
I just wanted to chime in. We've talked a little bit about Mueller tonight, and I've been looking at that recently for some other reasons, and I noticed that there's not often things on the market for Mueller, and when they are, they're quite expensive. They're not affordable for the kind of folks that live here. So I want to make sure that I'm also leaning towards scenario 2, where we have the variety of housing types, which you also see in Mueller, where you have the ability to walk to places, which you have in Mueller. So if we're trying to achieve these things, I also want us to make sure that we don't become so unaffordable by achieving this, that the people who are trying to benefit can't enjoy it because they can no longer afford to be here.
Right, right. And this will get at some of those factors. Your code will also get at some of those factors. Because there's so many things that do play into that affordability, everything from, you know, the size of the lots, the size of the units, the mix, achieving that mix of units, where you have enough inventory. There's a lot of different things that are going to factor into that. So we can certainly help you through this process to establish an initial framework where you've identified that as a priority, something that really must be taken into consideration when you're considering requests and you're also looking at your code update.
Yeah, I thought I'd just mention something about Miller and other developments like it serve. There are a couple things I think are important to point out about a development like that that's very different from conceptually making broad changes across your entire city. Miller is expensive for any number of reasons, but if you just go just outside of Miller, let's say 4 blocks over on the other side of Airport Boulevard, on a per square footage basis, those houses are less expensive, but they are, to a lot of people, to certainly the people who move into a place like Miller, they're a lot less desirable because they miss out on all of those things that you just talked about. Walkability, pleasant streets to be on, etc. And access to things like commercial activities and the kind of places you would want to walk to, right? Much of what is doing the heavy lifting on scenario 2 and the future land use plans that we're drafting for you guys aren't these little tiny pockets of super high intensity things. It's this broad allowance of usage mixes and intensity mixes across the city. And when you really commit to that, it keeps one particular place from being massively more desirable than all the rest. We're in one of those situations where we want a rising tide to lift all ships, as opposed to coming up with the magic tools that make one development the best development, and we can say, oh, it's the most walkable and beautiful place in the city, but then you lose out on these concepts of affordability. So much of what makes a city more affordable is adopting concepts like this broadly.
Right. Novelty is one reason that things are unaffordable, right? When we see that something like that is unattainable for most people, it becomes, the value on that tends to be heavily influenced by that, versus taking these concepts and weaving them into your codes and using them universally across your community. That starts to be something, to the mayor's point earlier, that's within reach for everyone. Quite literally, you're talking about distance from parks and things of that nature. So making it where some of these things are not so novel, because you've already provided a place for them and a way for them to come in, is also going to get to that. Great comments. Okay, well, I know you're all probably really ready to go home. So I think we've got some good consensus from you all. Sounds like, generally speaking, there's a lot of support for scenario 2. You definitely want to make sure that the things in scenario 1 that are here, and that there can be some allowance for those things to continue around the city, so that people do maximize their ability for choice. And it sounds like quality of life is something really big that we need to focus on as a centerpiece of putting this together, as well as trying to define and describe some of the contexts and some of the concepts that you shared with us tonight, so that as you're applying that plan, there's some certainty about how and where and when and why you can apply those things. Is there anything you think I've missed? Please let me know. I think you've given us some really good feedback, and I think we feel good about what we need to do next, so thank you for that. And certainly thank you for spending your time with us this evening. We know it's a late evening, but you've all been very helpful, and we really appreciate it, and we look forward to seeing you again. I think we'll be back in July, and so we will talk with you again soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you. All right, motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
All right.
We didn't vote.